Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'd like to introduce you or welcome you to the 14th Annual Canadian Fertilizer Products Forum, brought to you by Fertilizer Canada in joint partnership with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the Fertilizer and Supplements Advisory Committee. I'll be your moderator today. I'm Alison Gellinger from BASF, where I'm responsible for microbial products, among other things. I'm also a member of the Fertilizer and Supplements Advisory Committee Board of Directors. So today is our third session, and we'll be focusing on microbial product regulation with some information from Europe, from the US, and finally from Canada. We're going to have 3 presentations, which I will introduce shortly. And then after each presentation, there will be time for a brief Q&A. So if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box on your screen, and I will read them after the presentation concludes. And then once all the presentations have been given, we will have a panel discussion with all of our presenters. And any questions that we don't get to after that, we will gather them up and we'll get you feedback within the next couple of weeks. So that's why it's important to put them in the Q&A box on your screen. So without further ado, I'll start with our first presenter. Our first presenter is David Carden. David was born in Ireland and studied agricultural science at the University College Dublin. He moved to the United Kingdom to work as a scientific officer at the Horticulture Research Centre at East Malling. There he conducted research on ornamental plant production. David pursued his scientific studies, completing a research doctorate in cell-based plant physiology at Rothamsted Research. Subsequently, he pursued plant cell physiology research in Germany at Gießen University. David moved to industry, starting with the biostimulant company Pvalue in 2003. He has managed the Regulatory Affairs Department since 2007. David participated in the regulatory discussions in Europe from the beginning. This led to the new Fertilizing Products Regulation in 2019, containing a plant biostimulant category. David represents the European Biostimulant Industry Council at the technical meetings with the various European authorities. David will be speaking to us today on the regulatory situation and market implications of multiple use substances in Europe. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alison, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody, and thank you for this possibility. So again, apologies for my English, although my first language is English at this stage, it's probably a little bit mixed up. So if you're wondering where I am, I think Alison told you. So you'll probably hear various accents in there, but I'll try my best. So I'll start my presentation, and on the screen, I have been asked to talk about multiple use substances in Europe. So my presentation will talk a little bit about the general context without going into detail of the European regulatory framework and multiple use substances. And in particular, then I will talk about microbes within that. So I shall move this along. So as you may know already, but without going into detail, last year there was quite an important regulatory development here in Europe with the new regulation 1009, and that is a fertilizing product regulation, and fertilizing products covers a whole series of categories, and I will talk about some of those later on, in particular plant biostimulants and microbes in particular. And this new fertilizing regulation in Europe, apart from establishing a Euro-wide framework, also modified the existing plant protection, so let's call it pesticide regulation, to make room for what is now called plant biostimulants. And So I think in the past, David Hiltz has already presented the details of this new regulation and in other conferences, so I won't go into detail about that, but you can get a copy of that if you so wish. So in Europe today, what is the situation? And I think this general introduction might seem very simplified, but it's important because the logic behind that is important for what we're talking about today, which is dual use products or multiple use substances. And we will talk in detail about each of those. So in the European regulation, we have what are called PFCs, as unfortunately in any legislation, there is its own language and acronyms. So PFC stands for product function category. So basically, what does this product do? This product does based on the claim that you give to that product. And that's very important. This is the so-called claim-based approach. And you can see on the screen from the left-hand side, you have PFC1, what are called fertilizers. Their role is to provide nutrients. So they have a nutritional, in terms of NPK, etc., role for plants. PFC2, liming materials. So their role is to change the pH of the soil. And it goes on based on their role, what that product is expected to do. You will see towards the right, PFC6, biostimulants. And I'm here today with talking for ABIC, the European Biostimulant Industry Consortium. So in particular, we're interested in that. But the principles we're talking about today, I think, can go across many different categories. Another acronym, CMC, you'll see at the top of the screen. CMC stands for Component Material Category. So that is basically having your product and you know what it is. We saw on the previous screen, what can I put into that product? So the raw materials, let us say, what ingredients or substances can I put into my product? And there is a list, and you'll see on the screen there from 1 to 11, some on the left-hand side, some on the right-hand side. And there are various descriptions of categories of substances. And you'll see on the left-hand side, number 7, microorganisms. So that's relevant to today's discussion. So microorganisms have their own CMC category. So they are recognized as an input material that you can put into your product. Now, that is at the moment a positive list. So if anyone is interested, you open up the regulation and you'll find the CMC 7 microorganism list. That is a positive list. That means that you have a list of, in this case, let's say species or categories that you're allowed to use and none others other than those. So that list is quite short and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. That list can be expanded in theory, but there's no procedure yet defined for that. The important point is, though, that microorganisms are recognized as an input material in fertilizing products. Now, it's important, and in Europe, this was a long discussion, and I'm sure the same discussions are taking place around the world. I know for definite in the United States. And I'm sure in Canada, and we'll talk about that, I imagine, in the various presentations. You have ingredients and you have a product. So an ingredient is the raw material that you put into that. And you may have several raw materials formulated in different ways, and that becomes the preparation. But until that product is registered, or in using the language we have here in Europe now, that it's assessment for its conformity, but basically a procedure you go through and you have a label according to the rules, then it becomes a product. Until that time, it's only a preparation. So here we must distinguish between a product and what I put into the product as an ingredient. And this then we're coming now into the area of defining different ingredients that can have different uses. So we're getting close to dual use or multiple use at substance or ingredient level. And you can see on the final for the product, of course, the actual use of the product is based on what the preparation is. So what you have in there, how you apply it, when you apply it, what you apply it to, and you can get different results depending on on how you use that product. Now, this might all seem quite arcane, quite detailed sort of approach, but it's fundamental, this sort of language. So within Europe here, a fertilizing product as defined in the new regulation 1009, it's based on its use, not on what is in it, but it's based on its use. So it has a purpose. So the purpose of providing the plants or mushrooms with nutrients or improving their nutritional efficiency. Whereas a plant protection product, again, is based on its use. So it's based on, in this case, influencing the life processes of plants or influencing their growth, such as plant growth regulators, other than as a nutrient or as a plant biostimulant, because that's now part of the fertilizing product regulation. And of course, a plant protection product, of course, is used. And if you go to read the full regulation article, you'll see it's a pesticide, it will kill pests, etc. So the important point here is that all products, be they either a fertilizing product or a plant product, are based on their claim. So my claim is what defines the legislative framework that I must use. Now, there are some other interesting details in the fertilizing product regulation. Once you do a single conformity assessment, you are able to circulate freely in all 27. The European Union now, we've lost one state. We're down from 28 to 27. So 27 member states. And that's different to plant protection products, which must be authorized member state by member state. So it's a slightly different approach between pesticides and fertilizing products. So an EU biostimulant, which would be in the fertilizing product regulation, cannot have a plant protection property on its label. So at this stage, your conclusion is, well, that means you cannot have a dual use product. And I underline the use of the word product, and that is correct. You cannot have a biostimulant product with a plant protection claim on the same label. So let's go now to multiple use ingredients. So you'll see here three spheres which build into the, let's say, the logic we have here in Europe, and that may depend on the legislative context in each different country. However, on the bottom left, you see plant protection, so let's call it pesticides. On the right-hand side, fertilizers in the sense of nutritional fertilizers, and on the top, plant biostimulants. And as everybody knows, ingredients can have more than one action. So some of the typical ones at the bottom, you see copper. Everybody knows copper is an essential micronutrient, and it's typically a fertilizer, micronutrient fertilizer. But copper, of course, is also registered and well recognized as a fungicide. And it's also registered as a fungicide, definitely here in Europe, and I think probably across the world, one of the most well-known fungicides. So copper is a typical substance which can have more than one use. And it's only one of many. Sulfur is another one, for example. We don't have that listed here. But you can see on the top left then microorganisms. That, of course, microorganisms are well known as plant protection, biocontrol substances, let's call them substances or ingredients. But they're also biofertilizers, mycorrhiza, for example. So you can have many different uses for the same type of substance or ingredient. And there are other examples you see on the screen there. So here we have to distinguish between an ingredient, which may have more than one use, depending on how it's used, and the product having more than one use. And the dual use product, I think as you intended in Canada, means that you have a single product registered with more than one function and reporting on the label. That here in Europe would not be possible. So let's talk about microbial plant biostimulants, so PB, plant biostimulants, and multiple use. So a microorganism as an ingredient, and again, I underline ingredient instead of a product, can be a plant biostimulant, and plant biostimulant in Europe could also be equated to a biofertilizer in other parts of the world. But it can also be a plant protection product, so Bacillus subtilis, for example. Depending on how you use it, how it's formulated, you may have a foliar application, you may have a root application, a soil application, and these can have two different end uses. So you could have the same ingredient being used in different ways, giving different effects. okay? But of course, scientifically, and this then is a scientific discussion, and sometimes legislation has to draw the line somewhere, and it doesn't always coincide with science, but microbes are living organisms. So they have built-in natural defenses, whether they are labeled as a pesticide or a biostimulant or a biofertilizer. To survive in the soil or on the leaf, they have defense mechanisms. But they may not be necessarily relevant from an agronomical point of view. So you may have a particular microbe which could have some defense properties, but maybe not at a sufficient level to make it useful as a plant protection product. So the microbial product, what we're talking about here, is its intended use. What it is it actually going to be used for? So this is important. So as I said before, the products which have a plant protection use on it cannot be in the fertilizer product regulation. So within the fertilizing regulation, there is no such thing as a dual use product. This does not apply though to the substances, and I use and microorganisms, the ingredients, as we've just discussed. This is also recognized by the European Commission, who's the authority for this new regulation. And this is in a frequently asked question. And I will show that now in a second. So of course, if you have a fertilizer product, you cannot have labeled claims, and it should not have the function of being a pesticide, so plant diseases, for example. This is the text of a frequently asked question, the latest draft, which should be finalized quite soon. And one of the questions was, and you can read it here yourselves, and you will see it in the presentation when you get this later on, so I won't go through it all. But here, the Commission itself makes the important distinction between a product and the ingredient. And they make it clear that the ingredients, be they substances or microorganisms, are not excluded from a fertilizing product, even if those ingredients are also known to have pesticidal effects. The important thing is your final product does not have the function of a plant pesticide. Now, going back to science, I'm not a microbiologist, but some of my colleagues who know much more about this than me cite the often used mycorrhizal fungi, which are one of the categories in the new European regulation for plant biostimulants, and typically would be regulated under the fertilizer type regulations around the world, rather than a pesticide. But mycorrhiza, scientifically, are also well known to have defense properties. Yet nobody is insisting that they be registered as a plant pesticide. And so that's just one example which is used today in the European regulation to show that it's coherent. So getting towards now the end, I'm not sure if this is the last or second last slide. So multiple use substances as distinct from products, multiple use substances or organisms, let's call them ingredients, they are implicitly recognized. Now we're talking here today about microbes, but for anyone that's interested, there is one exception in the European regulation, and that's for phosphonates. It's the only exception which is excluded. There are various political reasons for that, and we won't go into that here. But here we're talking about microbes, so I'll leave that point for the moment. And within the frequently asked questions produced by the Commission, multiple use substances or organisms are explicitly recognized as a concept. So there's no problem in using a microorganism which can have more than one effect depending on how you use it. What's important is in your formulation, how it's used, what the real effect is, and what you're labeling. So this goes back to the claim-based approach that we started at the beginning. Of course, this all sounds wonderful, but there are some limitations, of course. As I suggested at the beginning, in the new European regulation, microorganisms, yes, they are recognized as an ingredient, and that is good. However, that list is very, very short at the moment. And there is no agreed procedure as yet to extend that. That is something we're working on, but at the moment there is no procedure. We would hope that that list will get longer. We wish it were not a list of species or genera, but maybe instead be a list of criteria to respect. But that is work in progress. But there's nothing imminent about to happen there. Europe is complicated. Yes, we have a European-wide regulation now, which is a big step forward. But of course, national authorities in each of the member states of the European Union, and there are 27 of them, they can sometimes take different opinions to European regulations. So sometimes you can have national rules, and as David Hills would definitely have told you in his presentation previously a few months ago, there are separate national legislations which will continue to live in a parallel way to the European regulation. And they are useful if you're operating only at a single member state level rather than European-wide. So there can be differences from state to state if you use the national legislations, but it's a European problem that we're not quite harmonized with everything. And MRLs, maximum residue limits, of course, this can be a problem because at the moment within Europe, MRLs, the residue limits are set only from the point of view of pesticides. So it does not take into account that you can have valid input channels to agriculture other than pesticides. And so that is something that we have to live with, that we may have problems depending on what happens in other legislative frameworks. But that is also something that we would hope to work on. We don't want everything immediately, of course. So I get to the end then of my presentation. I think I'm approximately on time, and I'll stop there for the moment. Back to you, Alison.
All right, thank you, David. That was making me really happy. I live in Canada. We have some questions coming in on the Q&A. So if anybody else has more questions, enter them in, but I'll start now with the questions that we have so far. First up, can you explain how plant growth regulators and biostimulants are differentiated?
So plant growth regulators today, if the effect of what you call a plant growth regulator is within the new fertilizing regulation, then theoretically you should be able to proceed with registering that substance and that product as a plant biostimulant. So it depends on the claim that you use. And if it's part of the claim in the new fertilizing regulation, you can do that. Nobody has done that yet. This is a brand new regulation, and it won't be fully operational until approximately 18 months' time. And I'm sure there may be some difficulty in actually implementing that from that point of view, but it should be possible.
Okay. Our next question, what biostimulants fall under REACH?
So REACH regulation in Europe, for anyone who doesn't know it, is a chemical legislation, an umbrella legislation covering all chemical substances, which basically means any chemical substance which is used must be assessed for its safety before it is used in a particular scenario. That is already up and running in Europe for a long time. So any substance that you use in a plant biostimulant or any other category within the fertilizing regulation must be compliant to the REACH regulation. So the REACH regulation applies there. It already applies today. So if you have any product today being sold in Europe with chemical substances in it, it should be already REACH compliant. There are some detailed discussions about what we call REACH plus requirements within the new fertilizer regulation, but I don't think that's the place here to talk in detail about that. But anything you use today compliant with REACH will probably be compliant also with the fertilizer regulation from a REACH point of view.
Okay.
I hope that answers it.
Next question. What is the accelerated procedure for determining shelf life and expiration date of a fertilizer that contains a bacteria? If there isn't one, what is the best guidance you have for one to determine in the lab the shelf life and expiration date for a fertilizer that contains a bacteria that is not new or well understood?
Wow, that's a very specific question. The technical standards to give expiry dates, etc., are being discussed at this very moment. So the definitive answer for that I do not have. For example, if you say I want to declare nitrogen or something like this in a fertilizing product, what's happening at the moment is the technical standards to legally tell you how to measure nitrogen are being drafted at the moment, and they should be ready in 18 months' time when this becomes fully operational. So watch this space.
Okay. Okay, our next question, can you discuss the politics on phosphonates?
Wow. I could, but because we're talking about microbes, I'm not sure I should spend time on that, but I could. Briefly, phosphonates, potassium phosphite, for example, is well known as a fungicide. And I won't get into any too much political discussion about that, but there was an attempt a few years ago in Europe to introduce it as a potassium fertilizer, which was rejected. There was some perhaps abuse of the market of phosphonate-based products, and it fell foul of the legislative process as the only substance to be excluded from the fertilizing regulation, which will go against the concept of dual use, multiple use substances, and that's something we will continue to fight, but it's victim of some politics, and I think it's better I stop there.
Okay. Our next question, can you distinguish between plant growth regulators and plant hormones?
That's very similar to the first question. Let's say no, because from a legal point of view in Europe, hormones are not defined. So based on the final effect of your product, you could become a plant biostimulant, for example, if you enter into the plant, the fertilizing product regulation definitions.
Okay, we've got two more left, and I'm hoping we get time for both of them. So if not, we'll ask you later. Are there any initiatives from EBIC to enable multi-use product registration with dual claims on the label in Europe? If yes, what challenges do you face with that?
No, it's not an initiative at the moment. So that is not something that we considered technically possible, and also the European authorities, because of the legislative framework within Europe where pesticides are authorized member state by member state, and the, let us say, plant biostimulants or fertilizers are going to be regulated at a European-wide level. So you could not have a European-wide pesticide registration. So at the moment, it's not technically possible, and it is not an initiative at the moment. Our big objective was to get plant biostimulants recognized as a category, which was achieved, and within the context of the new European regulation. And we would like to finish off the many areas that are still not finished, such as the list of microorganisms.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more. There's more questions that have come in. We'll get to those in a bit, but I'll do one last question here. Is there any chance that at some point regulators will use ecological data to determine what can or cannot be released into the environment? If bacteria is known to exist naturally at 10 to the 7, in or on a sugarcane plant at 100 million acres, then why would one not be allowed to apply it at that rate to a sugarcane field regardless of activity?
Very good question. So within the European fertilizing regulation, as it is written and at the moment, there are no criteria listed, which is something but we would like as ABIC. So at the moment, it's a positive list of, I'll say species, genus or species level, plus a category called mycorrhiza. These were decided by the European authorities as well-known, long-used fertilizing type organisms for which there were no safety issues. So they were put in there to establish a microbial ingredient list. And so that is good. However, we would prefer, first of all, to have a longer list and it not be a positive list in terms of species or genera. We would prefer criteria, and one of those type of criteria would be exactly what the person that asked the question could be considered. Now, then I think the question was even more interesting. If it exists naturally, why should anyone care if it's a pesticide or a plant biostimulant? This in Europe goes down to customer protection also, that if you sell a product with a certain claim, it should really do what you say it does. Therefore, in some way, you have to prove that it can do that. And therefore, the approach in Europe is protecting the final customer. At least that's the logic of it. So from an ecological point of view, I think that the question is absolutely spot on. Who cares if it's already present? And if you add a little bit more, it's not going to change anything. And if it doesn't change anything, why do you care what it does? And this goes down to the farmer. The farmer must have some sort of confidence that what he's buying is actually going to work, especially if it's a pesticide, where maybe the question is, may I save my crop or not? Or may I use it in an integrated plan to protect my from diseases? So I must know it actually works. So I think it does matter what it does and how well it does that. And so I personally think, and ABIC thinks, that efficacy is an important part of the credibility of our sector and an already established part of the credibility of the pesticide sector. I hope I answered that.
Okay. We'll leave the remaining questions until a little bit later on when we get to the panel, because I'd like to keep us on time. So we're going to move to our next presenter. Hold on. Our next presenter is Ed Thomas. Currently, Ed is the Director of Regulatory Affairs with the Fertilizer Institute, where he focuses on water quality and advocacy for the fertilizer industry. Most recently, Ed was employed as an engineer at the Virginia Department of Health, Department of Drinking Water. Formerly, he spent 10 years at the National Rural Water Association, Washington, D.C. office, serving as their Director of Regulatory Affairs. Prior to this, he worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Office of Water, and started his career as an environmental consultant. Ed graduated in 1993 from Virginia Tech with a Bachelor's of Science degree, and in 1996 from Johns Hopkins University with a master's degree in environmental engineering. Ed will be speaking to us today about the U.S. biostimulant path to market for microbials. Ed, it's yours.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Let's see.
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Thank you, Allison. Again, I am based in the US, have been working this biostimulant issue for a number of years now. I'm glad that David went first and tackled some of the hard questions, because I will say that we've learned a lot from the Europeans. We've tried to incorporate some of their some of their challenges into our thinking process. And I would say that we are facing many of the same challenges that I'll be addressing here today at a high level that they are facing. But they are under legislative pressure to have something in place in the next 18 months. So they do not have any choice. So that being said, I just wanted to quickly just show how broad and diverse this subject of biostimulants is. I mean, there's so many different types of potential products or potential ingredients, as David has well characterized. From proteins and organic, humic, and folic acids to the microbials, to the mycorrhizae and phytohormones, and then extracts. Primarily, where we're seeing the big market is the seaweed extracts, but also other extracts with chitin and things of that nature. So a real broad range of materials with many different traits, generally derived from natural sources, but really stimulates the natural process of the plant. So no pesticidal effects, no pesticidal claims, really complementing other fertilizer technologies to improve nutrient use efficiency, and improving the health and productivity and yield of crops. And a really important component of biostimulants is the concept of putting another tool in our ag retailers' certified crop advisors tool belt. So in other words, really helping putting biostimulants into the 4R framework and increasing sustainability while also increasing crop yields and improving environmental outcomes. That's a really important component of biostimulants here in the U.S. Is incorporating it into our 4Rs. Again, we do have a definition that made it into the USDA report to Congress, which I'll talk a little bit about later, but I did want to read our proposed definition. It's a plant biostimulant is a material that contains a substance, microorganism, or mixture thereof that when applied to seeds, plants, the rhizosphere, soil, or growth media, act to support a plant's natural nutritional processes independently of the material's nutrient content. The plant biostimulant thereby improves nutrient availability, uptake or use efficiency, tolerance to abiotic stress, and consequent growth, development, quality, or yield. And I would say this is pretty similar to the EU's. But I would also add that in an effort to get international harmonization, we have gotten the International Standards Organization's Technical Committee 134, which is the fertilizers, soil amendments and beneficial substance committee, which now has a biostimulants working group. They have adopted this exact definition at the committee draft stage. So what that means is it's not likely to go through final draft and be published as an ISO definition with the exact language that it was in the USDA report to Congress. But it may be massaged a little, it may come out that way, but something close to this anyway. So we're really trying to strive for international harmonization. On the left here are really kind of been what have been the core guiding principles, if I can characterize it as that, or goals that the biostimulant industry has in the U.S. have been banking on, and these have been the guiding principles of every type of regulatory framework that we take a look at or to engage with. So, we really want to be able to use this term biostimulant. We're not able to do that right now in the US. We want to make those claims. We're really focused on credibility, and that's why we're so focused on efficacy, and we're really struggling. I'm going to go over that a little bit on that framework. Again, a clear path to market, one label for all states. Where we have this conundrum of 50 state labels for all the fertilizer products here in the US. One safety assessment. Again, David covered nicely dual uses for active ingredients. I think we'll likely come out somewhere in that same position where it's claims based. At least that's where we hope to come out. And then lastly, their global consistency. So really two efforts on the right side of the screen there. One, I talked about this USDA report to Congress. It was part of the Farm Bill. Industry really came together and put together our recommendations for a regulatory framework and a plant biostimulant definition, and provided that to USDA, and they used that our recommendations to an extent, although I think they to some extent punted a little bit and put in 6 or 7 different options for Congress to consider. So now USDA is waiting on Congress to tell them what to do. Congress is waiting on USDA to say, these are the next steps. So we're kind of in this chicken and egg position. We were really waiting until after the election. The election's over, obviously, but it's not decided. And I think we have some weeks in front of us and some drama to endure here in the U.S. Before we get a convincing outcome. So on the other side of the coin, we have EPA, and they regulate pesticides under FIFRA. That's the Fungicide Insecticide Rodenticide Act. And they put out a draft guidance for biostimulants, which caused a lot of ruckus here in the US, where they included at a very high level what was referred to as Table 4, which basically they said if you are trying to use any of these substances, which they included in Table 4, humic and fulvic acids and seaweed extracts, amongst others, then you have to go through FIFRA. And so that went totally against the claims-based approach that FIFRA was intended to be written and based on. And so we as an industry were fairly it would have tanked us, really. It really would. So we did some advocacy work, and I think we have some unofficial notice now that guidance has been submitted over to OMB, over to the White House, and it does not have Table 4 in it, which is good news. Now that's only hearsay, but pretty credible. So we'll see when that guidance comes out what will happen. So we're pretty happy about that. I'm not going to go into deep detail on this time frame. I'm going to focus in on 2020 to the first quarter of 21. What we've done as an industry is we've brought together that USDA effort, brought that industry back into active engagement, working on 4 work streams, really. One on efficacy, biostimulant efficacy, one on safety, one on composition and methods, and then the last one, which is kind of a all-encompassing group, is a stakeholder coordination, just making sure that everyone's engaged, everybody's that may be impacted by our work is educated, and we are reaching out and touching all the players. So what those work streams consist of, I'm going to go into detail on the first 3 on microbials here in a few minutes. But obviously efficacy, we really want to have a sound, robust framework to support that claim of increasing credibility for the industry. We make sure it's safe, but we really don't want to be limited to the list of microbes that the EU is working under, where they're really confined to specific genuses or species or strains, not strains, but genuses or species of four microbe genuses or species, and then composition and method, really from an enforcement and regulatory perspective, of making sure that the end user gets what he's the manufacturer says is in the product. So on the microbial side, for efficacy, we are very, very challenged in coming up with what I would categorize as a robust framework that weeds out the bad actors, so that we don't have any bad products on the market that are confusing the marketplace or doing more harm than good for the marketplace, versus supporting innovation and supporting the smaller companies and making sure that we're not overburdening the efficacy requirements so that it's so expensive or so overly complicated that they can't bring their product to market. And so that is a delicate balance. And we are putting some of the best minds together. We're trying to leverage some of the work that the EU is doing. They are also struggling with this same concept. I'll just go over a few of them. The number of studies. Do you need 2 studies to support your efficacy claims? Do you need 10 or 12 studies? How many crops do you have to test on? Is it groups of crops? If you say like monocots and you do 2 subgroups within the monocots, do you then get to claim that your product works for the whole category of monocots? There is a lot of debate here in the US over what the right answer is to that. Again, I would say there's a lot of debate over the confidence levels, over p-values. Is it 95% confident? Or is this, agricultural studies that tend to not rely on that particular value, but rely on other trend data or rely on other processes to prove efficacy? Or perhaps, we're fiddling with the idea of maybe it's a p-values of 0.05 within a very tight laboratory controlled environment. But then when you venture from there to the greenhouses, to the field, to in situ, maybe it's 90%, maybe it's 85% confidence. We're really looking at a number of different ways to kind of sharpen our pencil and come up with some creative ways to prove efficacy. Again, peer-reviewed studies or other studies that may, how do we characterize what meets the acceptable level of criteria to prove efficacy? And then lastly, I'm just moved down to my last bullet point, is this concept of provisional approval status. And this is a concept of saying, well, maybe a manufacturer can't quite get to that 90 or 95% confidence level. And but he has some trend data that really looks good. And so he gets a provisional market approval to go to market with his product for, say, 2 to 3 years, while he has his product to market. He's collecting data and he's proving that his product works, or he or she's products works more and more and more over those 2 or 3 years of provisional approval. So that's a concept that we're also dangling with. On the microbial safety side of things, we're looking at this really as a flow. This is a simple flow diagram that kind of in one slide presents everything. I'm just looking at my clock. Am I doing okay on time? Yeah. Okay.
You're doing okay.
Okay. So microorganisms. So in the highest level is a microorganism live. If it's live, then you proceed down this kind of checklist. If it's not, then you would follow another kind of tree diagram. It's the substances tree. So it's a different safety process for microorganisms that are not living. So if it's living, you know, has it already gone through a safety assessment? Have you, can you go find assessment qualities through like the Food and Drug Administration, or perhaps through EFSA, for the European safety microbial standards? And we're really looking, keeping our minds open to other possibilities of other demonstrated safety assessments. But if you do not have any of those demonstrated safety assessments, then you have to confirm the identity of the microorganism, and then confirm its risk assessment. So using if there's any risk assessments out there to put a biosafety level. In other words, these biosafety levels are established under biosafety level 1 and 2, which are risk group 1 and risk group 2, which are like bacillus or things of that nature. But if you get into these biosafety levels of risk group 3 and 4, like anthrax, and some of these really dangerous microbials, they're thrown out, and they don't get approved any longer. But if you land in that kind of risk group 1 and 2 box, then you can move forward and do a literature search, and see if looking for any negative toxicity literature searches, and if you find sufficient data from that literature search that can properly characterize a risk assessment, and you can conduct a risk assessment based on that literature, then you are complete, and you don't have to go any further. But if you can't conduct that risk assessment, then you need to move forward with testing on human health and the environment. We are really focused on this testing, not as David said, is not on the product side, but testing on the microorganism itself, so the ingredient. And then lastly, if the testing comes out well enough that you can interpret the results, and make sure that there's no toxicity or other things that you can't put on the label that can be mitigated. For example, it's really toxic to fish, and that you can't use that next to water. But you can do these, these calculated risk assessments, and come out with labels, with protective measures on your labels. Then you can move forward. So that's kind of our very high level, our framework for safety. Oops. On composition, on composition, this is really pretty straightforward stuff. Just the name and taxonomic classification of the microorganism, the minimum guaranteed number of organisms that you are going to be guaranteeing in your product, the method that you're going to use for identifying the strain or the species of the microorganism, what method you're going to be using to do that. Is it rDNA sequencing, or is it some proprietary method that's generated in-house in the manufacturer's house? Again, country of origin and any historical genetic modifications. You have to demonstrate it, going back to the safety side, you have to demonstrate that it's not a pathogen. Going back to one of the questions that David answered on shelf life and stability, to make sure that that information is included on the label, the derived from statement, and then a requirement, again, going back to safety, is that each organism be in a deposit culture collection. And then the pathogens, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but these are very similar to the EU's requirements, but from microbial pathogens, both in products, and products and fermented products. So that is where I am. I'm a little over on time, I think, but I will turn it back over to Allison.
Okay. That was a lot to take in. We've got a number of questions now. The first question, will the p-value of 0.05 be based on lab or field data?
So that's a good question. So we, I think we are fiddling with the idea, and this isn't concrete, but this is something that we're going to be discussing further, of possibly using p-values of 0.05 within the lab, and then as you go to the greenhouse, maybe you go to 0.1, and then if you go into the field, you go to 0.15, or something in that general, something of that nature, I would say.
So our next question is sort of on the same topic. No statistical significance, but provisional registration while attempting to prove efficacy. Is that not the literal definition of p-hacking?
We're trying to be creative. So what I would say is I would welcome you guys to help us formulate a really good, robust framework that also allows innovative companies to bring their product to market. And it is a challenge, my friends. There's no easy solutions.
Okay, our next question. Regarding the proposed safety assessment criteria for microbial biostimulants, is the potential for a microorganism to spread antimicrobial resistance considered? This is a key concern for the EU regulations by EFSA.
I'm gonna default to David's feedback. Was I'm not a microbiologist. It's a good question, and I'm really not qualified to answer that question. Some of our industry experts who are probably on this call could probably answer that question with great aptitude. But I will dig deeper and try to find out the answer to that question and follow up with you guys later.
Okay, our next one. Many biosafety 1 microbes used in agriculture can also be opportunistic infectious agencies. For example, oh boy, Pantoia agglomerans, an anaerobic gram-negative bacillus, is a rare cause of opportunistic infections affecting premature infants to seniors. That end the question fall. Oh, he's got more. Hold on, there's more. Would a literature report of such an infection trigger infectivity studies?
What's the last? Would it trigger?
Sorry. So if your microorganism, if there is a report that in the literature that your microorganism might cause opportunistic infections, and you find this literature report, is that going to trigger infectivity studies?
So this is where we are considering how to set this safety assessment up. Is it going to be one person in every state? Is it going to be a national organization? But we clearly need people on the regulatory front that have the background, that have the information, that the industry can talk to back and forth and say, no, we believe this, we believe that. And they come to a logical conclusion at the end of the day to support whether or not further studies are going to be needed based on because this is I mean, there are detailed questions like this for hundreds of different products and or microbial strains. And so it's really going to have to be set up to have this interface between regulator and industry.
Okay, we've got a few more questions. I'll see how many of them we can get through. In the proposed microbial regulatory framework, safety, should a risk assessment and literature review be performed on a species or a strain level? Do you expect challenges with rapidly changing microorganism taxonomy and reclassification of specific strains from one species to another?
I'm gonna attempt to answer this generally. Again, this is a very detailed question, but generally, if you are working with a specific strain of a microbe, that would be that is causing the effect on the plant, then that is where we would like to focus the literature search. Now, if there is not any literature on that particular strain, then you could back up to the species and then use that to support any further refinement of your risk assessment. So it really is going to be it's really going to rely on, is there sufficient data to support a scientifically valid risk assessment? I think that is about detailed as an answer that I can get into.
And do you have any comment on what happens when you do all of your search off of one taxonomy and then something happens to change the taxonomy later, or what would happen there?
I'm gonna have to get back to ask my industry experts on that detail.
Okay, I'll do one more question. We've got a couple more after that. So one more question. Will reporting on secondary metabolite production likely also be required for biostimulants like it is today for FIFRA regulated products?
That's a really good question. Not one that I have contemplated. And I will say this: we are actively contemplating amending FIFRA to exclude biostimulants specifically from underneath that legislation. Now, we're just talking about it. And it really, it'll depend a lot on the outcome of this election, if there's a new administration, and the general will of industry to not open up FIFRA. I would characterize it as differently as not opening FIFRA up, but just politely amending it to exclude biostimulants and perhaps some other tweaks to that organization, to that legislation that improves innovation, that gets product to market quicker for farmers, and so that farmers have these products that improve crop yields, but yet are taking advantage of all of these innovative products that are hitting the market. So I would say more to come, and I would welcome your input through email or other about what your thoughts are on excluding those metabolites.
Okay. An action for all of us. Thank you very much. I will now introduce our third presentation. This comes to us from the agencies. So Michael Downs from PMRA, after graduating with a Master of whoops, sorry, my screen changed. After graduating with a Master of Science in Plant Sciences in 1998 from the University of Western Ontario, Michael began his career in the Federal Public Service with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in 1999 at the Harrow Research Centre, first as a member of the Weed Science and then the Weed Ecology Research Programs. With the creation of AAFC's Pest Management Centre in 2003, Michael transferred to Ottawa to join AAFC's Minor Use Program as the Herbicide Project Coordinator. In 2006, Michael joined the Pest Management Regulatory Agency in his current position as section head of the Antimicrobials and Herbicide section in the Value Assessment and Reevaluation Management Directorate. There, he works with a team of scientists conducting value assessments of antimicrobials and herbicides and managing the Pesticide Sales Information Reporting Program. Presenting with him is Eva Maddie. Eva is the National Manager of the Fertilizer Safety Section at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. She has been managing the fertilizer program for 10 years now. Eva received her PhD in plant physiology from the University of Waterloo, and this field of study has always been her passion. She lives in Ottawa, Ontario, with 2 lovely dogs. Michael and Eva will be speaking to us today about the regulation of dual property products, specifically microorganisms. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Allison. So just for those of you following along, I'm going to take us through the presentation here, and then when we come to the question and answers at the end, Eva and I will be taking a team approach to address your questions, depending on the specific nature of the questions. So we'll figure out who's likely best positioned to respond to those when they come up. So having said that, I think I'll just jump right into the presentation here. Just a short outline here. We both represent regulatory agencies. So we're going to be starting by going over the various legislative and regulatory authorities that apply to these dual property products, specifically those products that are based on microorganisms. Then that will lead into a discussion of what is it when we say a supplement pesticide product? What do we mean by that? And then finally, a bit of information on the working group that's been established between the PMRA and the CFIA and some of our progress to date and where we hope to be going forward in the future. So first of all, for legislative authorities, within Canada, the Pest Control Products Act is what regulates all pest control products in Canada. And I'll just point out here, as we've seen in some of the earlier presentations, the terminology is very important. We tend to use the word pesticides, but this act addresses pest control products. So that includes pesticides in the traditional sense, but it includes other products also. So we have a definition of a pest control product in that legislation, and you can read through the whole thing if you really want to. But the important part is highlighted at the end there in underlined text. It's really a product that is used to control, destroy, attract, or repel a pest. And that's in bold because that's another definition we have to look to. Or it's a product for mitigating or preventing the injurious, noxious, or troublesome effects of the pest. And what you'll see when we get there is the definition of a pest is maybe not you would intuitively think it is in terms of the common usage of that word. There are some other clarifications in terms of what a pest control product is. So secondly, any active ingredient, this would be the specific chemical compound that is used to manufacture those products described above. And then finally, any other thing that is prescribed to be a pest control product. This is not carte blanche for the PMRA to determine anything to be a pest control product. It is very specific, but you have to go to the regulations that support this act in order to determine what else has been prescribed to be a pest control product. So the definition of the pest is the next thing that we have to look at. And certainly it does include those things that we normally think of as a pest. So the pest could be an animal, plant, or other organism that is injurious, noxious, or troublesome, again, directly or indirectly. So these are the things that we typically think of as being pests. These are insects, weeds, plant diseases. But then the definition of the pest goes on to include an injurious, noxious, or troublesome condition or organic function of an animal, a plant, or other organism. So this is when it starts to get a little bit more gray in terms of what is a pest within the Act. Here, this definition is picking up things that are typically not normally thought of as pests. So this would include such things as physiological disorders of plants, or sometimes naturally occurring physiological states of plants. And these definitions are what cause us to have some quite long and protracted discussions, either within the PMRA or between the two agencies, as you'll see as we move along here. So now if we turn to the Fertilizers Act and regulations, again, there are some definitions that come into play when we're talking about these dual property products. So first of all, fertilizer is any substance or mixture of substances, and here specifically containing nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or other plant food that's manufactured, sold, or represented for use as a plant nutrient. Now, this is in here just for the sake of completeness. When we're talking about dual property microbial products, fertilizers don't come into play directly because at least I'm not aware of nitrogen being a microorganism. I think that's pretty obvious. However, if we turn to another definition in that act, the definition of a supplement, it's a very general and broad definition. It's any substance or mixture of substances other than a fertilizer, so other than described above, that is manufactured, sold, or represented for use in the improvement of the physical conditions of soils or to aid in plant growth or crop yields. So with all of these definitions in mind, and I'll forgive you if there's questions of clarifications that come up at the end. When we now turn specifically to what we're calling supplement pesticide products, these are products that both meet the definition of a pest control product, and I'm recognizing now that we probably shouldn't call them supplement pesticide products because they may or may not be pesticidal in nature, but certainly they do meet the definition of a pest control product, and they meet the definition of a supplement under the Fertilizers Act. So what does that really mean? You know, other than talking about this in an abstract sense, what types of products are we really talking about here? Well, for one thing, it could include plant growth regulators. It could include what we call non-conventional products at the PMRA. So these are non-synthetic chemistries. They could be biological products, which certainly includes microbial. They could be living organisms. But also they could be synthetic conventional products that have supplement effects and pest control effects. To further describe some of the complexities here, these products could have single ingredients. So for example, pyraclostrobin, this is a synthetic fungicide, and it is also purported to have what would be considered supplement effects within the definition of the Fertilizers Act. Also Bacillus subtilis, to use an example of a microorganism, or gibberellic acid as an example of a plant growth regulator. There's also possible multi-ingredient products that would be both supplements and pest control products in one. There is an example here of a registered product. It contains thiodiazole as well as indole butyric acid. So this product is registered, it has supplement claims on the label, and it has pest control product claims, although those are plant growth regulator claims being a type of pest control product claim on the label. Now the regulation of these products, the products that are both supplements and pest control products, is more complex than a similar group of products, which would be the fertilizer pesticide products. And the reason that it's more complex here is that if we look at the fertilizer pesticide products, we have existing exemptions in place within the regulations that allows for a mechanism for these types of products to be jointly regulated. I'm not going to dwell on that today because we're focusing on the supplement pesticide products, but if anyone would like me to clarify that in a question, I'm happy to do so afterwards. So both acts, the Pest Control Products Act and the Fertilizers Act, and their supporting regulations apply to these supplement pesticide products because there are no specific exemptions in the regulations or the acts that would give us a clearer path on how to regulate these types of products. So it's a bit of a conundrum. Recognizing these challenges, a working group was set up between the PMRA and the CFIA, and the objective of this working group, it's no small challenge, is to develop a joint regulatory mechanism for certain supplement pesticide products. And we're saying certain supplement products because we want to take a small little chunk and see if we can come up with some success here, and then build on that success and see if it can be expanded to other supplement pesticide products. So the ultimate goal here, the end state that we're trying to achieve, would be a single marketplace label. So one label on your product sitting on the shelf, and that label would have both supplement claims and pest control product claims. So our current scope right now, and consistent with our discussion today, is for microbial products. Our progress to date, first and foremost, we wanted to make sure we were absolutely clear on the regulatory authorities for the label claims. So what authorities does the CFIA have, and what authorities does the PMRA have? And so it's been clarified, abiotic stress tolerance, claims of nutrient mobilization, for example, would fall under the Fertilizers Act, and CFIA would regulate those claims. PMRA, however, we would regulate claims that relate to direct effects on pest organisms, as well as indirect effects on pest organisms. So as an example, this could be competitive displacement. And also PMRA would regulate claims associated with systemic acquired resistance or induced systemic resistance, because in these cases, it's resistance to a plant pest that is the outcome of that mechanism. We've also come up with a concept of what this dual registration might look like. We're trying to keep it simple. If at all possible, I don't think anybody really wants to reopen either act or the regulations, because as soon as you do that, automatically your time frame is probably, I don't know, 2 to 10 years, depending on how things go. So we're trying to work within the existing frameworks and see what flexibilities might be available to us. And so what we've come up with is, we would retain the independent assessments that are currently conducted by the PMRA and the CFIA. But at the end of those independent assessments, we would have one integrated label with both sets of claims. So the label would have the pest control claims as well as the supplement claims. Similarly, that label would have 2 registration numbers on it, both the PCPA registration number and the fertilizers registration number. And if nothing else, this would be an indication right on the front of that label that this product has 2 sets of claims. There's 2 regulators that are involved here because it's making reference to two different pieces of legislation. So having said that, there's still a lot of work ahead of us to be completed. But here's an idea of what it is we feel we need to do next in order to advance this project and try to work towards that desired outcome of having a single label in the marketplace. First and foremost, we need to make sure we've got senior management approvals in place. It shouldn't come as a surprise that if Eva and I think this is a great idea, but senior management doesn't agree, it's not going to go very far. So we've been working with senior management within both agencies to ensure that everybody buys in and agrees to what it is we're proposing here. And those discussions are ongoing. We'd like to identify potential pilot project candidates. So as an example, are there products right now that have a registration with the PMRA and a registration with the CFIA, and these would be microbial products? This would give us an opportunity to see how easy or how difficult might it be to integrate those two sets of claims into one label. Right now we have this concept in mind, but until we actually try to do it, we're not really sure what other complications might pop up along the way. So we'd like to conduct that pilot project. In doing so, this will help us determine any operational interactions between the two agencies. We might think it's going to be simple and straightforward, but going through this pilot project, we might find out, oh, well, we forgot to consider a couple minor things, so let's deal with those now and figure them out. Along the way, we want to engage with our stakeholders. That's what we're doing today, and we'll be continuing to do this as we make progress moving forward. Ultimately, once we've reached that point and we're fairly confident that we have something in place that we can work with, our intention would be to draft a guidance document. And this guidance document, as is common practice, we would be putting it out for stakeholder consultation and feedback before we implement anything officially. Again, as a way of making sure that we got it right and we're not creating any unforeseen challenges or difficulties in the process. Assuming all goes well, then we would be able to turn our attention to future consideration of other types of dual property supplement pesticide products. So again, just to reiterate, all of this work that I've been describing just now, this is in the context of microbial products. And if we can figure it out for microbial products, then we might be able to move on to other types of products. As an example, another group that we might want to consider could be plant growth regulators. So that's it for the presentation. I think we have plenty of time now for questions. So Allison, I will turn it back over to you if you want to read the questions.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I'm always excited about this one. We do have quite a few questions that have come in. The first one, are supplemental pesticides, are supplemental pesticides an actual regulatory category in Canada?
So the quick and easy answer to that is no. We don't have, because there's two pieces of legislation involved, there isn't a single definition for and I wouldn't call it a supplemental pesticide, but a supplement pesticide product. These definitions arise from the two different pieces of legislation. So for that reason alone, they don't fall into one neat category. There's the two pieces of legislation that apply depending on how the product is used. And so that's what we're trying to figure out right now without having to try to open up either of the acts or the regulations and create new definitions and new frameworks.
Well, just really quickly from our perspective, as you know, that the modernization of the fertilizer regulations is proceeding quite nicely. And I don't want to steal my own thunder from the 17th of November, but we are definitely going to be in Canada Gazette Part 2 by then, which is definitely a very exciting news. So as part of the definitions, we have introduced the definition of a supplement pesticide, which means anything that is or contain a pesticide as referred to in the Pest Control Products Act. So with respect to definitions, our regulations do cover that, but the pesticide component obviously is still entirely within the wheelhouse of PMRA.
Okay. Our next question, how will you deal with application and usage directions on the label for both supplement and pest claims?
Well, that really remains to be seen, which is why we want to do the pilot project and have a kick at the can, so to speak. At this point, we're blind. We don't really know to what extent those two sets of claims and use directions might be consistent with each other or might deviate from each other, or even worse, be contradictory or be in conflict with each other. So that's why we think there's some work to be done to see what exactly might happen when we try to do this so that we can think about it and sort it out along the way.
Well, and from our perspective, obviously, we we would not, since the final marketplace label will actually come to CFIA for approval, again, the provisions in the new regulations state that as a prerequisite to registration under the Fertilizers Act, the product has to be compliant with PCPA and the associated regulations with respect to the safety of the product. So just to give you an example, and I guess our thought process is that if the proposed directions for use imply a higher application rate or frequency that PMRA has approved and was comfortable with, this would not be permitted. So anything from a supplement perspective, whether you apply it at a lower rate or equal rate to what PMRA has determined to be safe, then that's sort of the threshold that we're working with.
Our next question. While assessing dual property product claims, efficacy, manufacturing, and formulation independently, would PMRA and CFIA consider joint or shared safety assessment of dual property products?
So we did actually speak quite a bit about this within the working group. We did consider options that would include things such as a work share or a joint review type of a model. But again, with the desire to try to make progress sooner rather than later, recognizing there's a lot of differences between the two agencies, not only in terms of the data requirements, but the timelines to conduct the reviews, the fees associated with those reviews. What we've elected to do is to not try to do any sort of a joint risk assessment or safety assessment. But having said that, Eva, did you want to speak to this?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, we do not and will not take efficacy and product performance under consideration. We no longer have the authority to do so, as everybody knows. So that kind of portion of the evaluation for CFIA, it doesn't really play a factor. Now, when it comes to the joint assessments, you know, from what I understand, PMRA has a very structured process, and what they refer to as joint risk assessments or joint reviews, there are very specific criteria, processes, and limitations around it. I think that as long as we consider and consult with the applicant and they express permission, written permission for us to share and talk about the assessments, I think that that is definitely something that could be implemented. And no, we're not going to reinvent the wheel. From a legal or regulatory perspective, the assessments are going to be independent, but it doesn't mean that we have to sit behind closed doors and say, no, I won't talk to you kind of thing. So I think it's important to recognize that there is we're gonna try to exercise as much flexibility as possible. The other element is obviously, which is going to be, like Michael said, one of the things to consider is the sequence of events. So is the application coming to the PMRA separately or prior to coming to CFIA, and how does that work? If there are outcomes of safety assessments that PMRA is doing within their purview, and the applicant is prepared for us to discuss it, we are obviously going to take it under consideration. Nothing different there. We have been doing that obviously along the lines with both domestic regulatory bodies as well as international regulatory bodies. So if somebody actually provides a risk assessment or an outcome of a risk assessment from Environment Canada or Health Canada or EU, it's not like we're going to reject the data. Of course, we're going to take a look at it. And it's exactly the same with PMRA. Obviously, their consideration, as Michael said, even with respect to human health and environmental safety, may be slightly different. So it's not seamless, but we're going to try to exercise as much flexibility as we can within the confines of the regulatory framework that is in place in order to really ultimately try to expedite the process as much as possible, because that really is the ultimate goal.
Okay. Sort of a related question, and I'm not quite going in the right order here, but is there a way to apply to be a part of the PMRA CFIA pilot project?
I don't think we have any official way, but certainly if you wanted to let either Eva or myself know, that would be one way to do it. But there's also an FSAC working group that we're coordinating with. And Loretta, who asked one of the earlier questions today, so she's here in this session. She's the chair of that working group, I believe. And so you could certainly send that information through Loretta and it would find its way to us also.
And just to add to that, I think that similar to the Canadian Fertilizer Products Forum, so CFPF, FSAC and their working groups, because the model is quite similar, is that ideally, you know, as opposed to just one company sending a request to Michael, another company sending a request to me, and then we have 20 different requests flying around. If interested parties, particularly those that have vested interest in dual registration products, if they can participate in the working group and the industry can come up with consensus-based recommendation as to, you know, we think that this particular product is the best pilot, then that definitely would be welcome for us to consider. So there is agreement in all parties involved as to what should we take a look at first.
So shifting slightly off of microbials, during the first day of presentations, Greg Bartley with the Pulse Commission raised the issue of MRL violation from the use of phosphites instead of phosphorus for P.
Yeah.
What type of activity is being taken to look at the use of phosphites by fertilizer and nutritional companies in Canada?
Well, what kind of activity is the industry taking is a completely different story. But from a regulatory perspective, we very much are aware of the issue. And I did attend the first presentation. We've been working with Pulse Canada very closely to really narrow down the potential sources of contamination, and phosphate being one of them. From CFIA perspective, in this guidance and trade memorandum has been in place for some time now. Phosphites, when they're represented as fertilizers alone or sold alone, are not permissible. They are not considered nutrients. They are not a source of plant available phosphorus. Moreover, there are some phytotoxicity concerns, particularly when the product is used under phosphate limiting conditions in the soil. So phosphites are, and this I know has been an ongoing debate in the US as much as it is in Canada. And we actually have been quite vocal at the American Association of Plant Food Control Officials in the States to really indicate to them that phosphites themselves are not fertilizers and should not be regulated as such. They are definitely, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, they have well-established pesticidal or fungicidal properties that are some registered under PMRA. So that's great. So we have specific guidance as to what to do with phosphates. Now, the one thing that is still a possibility is when the phosphate is used as a carrier for other plant available nutrients, whether it is calcium or potassium or something like that. However, during the assessment process for that, the whole concept of phytotoxicity has to be considered, and the use pattern, the frequency of application, as well as precautionary statements that we will require on the label very often will reflect that. So, yeah. So bottom line is phosphates are not fertilizers, and that's sort of the take-home message.
Okay. I think I'm going to take one more question for the dual purpose topic, and then I think we'll open it up. I know we've got more of them, but I'd like to cover off some of these previous questions while we have a chance. So, dual purpose. Under this dual purpose product assessment, would there be an expectation that 2 data packages are created and submitted to the CFIA and PMRA independently?
Well, certainly the expectation is a data package would be submitted independently to each of the 2 agencies. Whether it needs to be 2 distinct data packages or not, it really depends on the data requirements that each agency has identified for the specific product. So it is entirely possible that one data package would meet the requirements of both agencies, but we are looking at 2 independent assessments. Now, having said that, the one thing I should clarify is the work that we're undertaking here, it's not the intention to force anyone to register with both agencies, a dual property product, but rather to create that option if you wish to do so. So as is currently the case, you could continue to register only a supplement with CFIA, or you could register your product only as a pest control product with the PMRA. But if you have both of those approvals in place, then you would have the option of this integrated dual property label.
The other consideration that I just want to really quickly mention, and that's another sales pitch for CFIA, we are moving into the 21st century, and moving towards electronic submissions. Now, our system and our platform, I don't know to what extent, if at all, is going to be compatible with PMRAs. So that's another reason why, if you're going through the My CFIA portal and the electronic submission system for CFIA, it is going to be different, and you can submit an application and move to the next step unless you fill in all the required fields. So it's not like we're not going to talk, like I said, it's not like we're going to not share results of assessments, but logistically, from a process perspective, I think that it would be very challenging trying to merge IT systems. It took us long enough to get there here, so.
Okay. If we could get David and Ed back on, I'd like to pose some of those earlier questions to them. 1 and 2. Okay. So I've got a question for David. Just need to find it here. David, what types of claims? Oh, have I got the right question? Yes, I do. What types of claims are typically used for microbial PGRs in Europe for a product registered under the European pesticide law?
Okay. For example, it could be some quality type traits such as gibberellic acid and distance between grapes in a grape bunch. That could be one. Flowering promotion, for example, that could be another. Fruit set could be another typical one. Those will be the typical types of claims for PGRs under the plant protection, so the pesticide regulation in Europe. And I guess if it's not written there, then the next question would be, well, would those become plant biostimulants under the new fertilizing regulation? And my answer to that is linked to an earlier question, but maybe that wasn't asked at all, so I'll stop.
So a similar question, and I believe this would go to Michael Downs. How are PGRs defined in Canada?
Well, there's probably a couple definitions is my bureaucratic answer. Officially, in terms of the Pest Control Products Act, they are not defined. So there is no definition of a plant growth regulator within the Act or the regulations. There's a fairly old guidance document, a directive that is speaking to what is a plant growth regulator. But this is one of the challenges that we have, is that because there is no definition of a plant growth regulator within our legislation, it's captured by that part of the definition of the pest. So if you remember, the first part of the definition was the typical insects, diseases, and weeds. And then the second component of that definition, where you're talking about the troublesome, injurious, or noxious condition or organic function of an organism, that's what catches some plant growth regulators or some uses of plant growth regulators within the Pest Control Products Act. And the flip side to that is other plant growth regulators or other uses of plant growth regulators, if they don't meet the definition of a pest control product, they very likely meet the definition of a supplement within the Fertilizers Act. So this is one of those areas where sometimes it's very difficult to know, where do you apply to register your product? If it's a plant growth regulator, is it with CFIA or PMRA? And sometimes the answer is both, depending on the specific claims. Gibberellic acid is a really good example of that, where there's any number of effects that can be associated with the use of gibberellic acid, depending on when you use it and at what concentration and whatnot. Some of those effects meet the definition of a supplement. Other effects meet the definition of a pest.
And I'm just building on what Michael said. I think that it's very key, particularly in the context of plant growth regulators, to consider the concentration. So depending on the biological window of activity that a plant growth regulator has, it has completely dual properties. So, for example, I mean, as simple as that, synthetic auxin is 2,4-D. It will promote shoot development and growth and proliferation and cell division, but it will also kill the plant depending on the concentration. So it's quite legitimate that some of these products from their physiological plant responses can either meet the Pest Control Products Act definition or a supplement definition or both.
And I think just to highlight, I think my doorbell has quieted down here. You might have heard it there. To really show how it's the use of the specific molecule that can sometimes be the deciding factor. If we look at something like 2,4-D, very well-known herbicide. Well, if you apply 2,4-D in a low concentration at the right time, it can elicit what we would call a plant growth regulator effect. In that, if you're growing red-skinned potatoes, you can have enhanced red coloration in the skin of those potatoes through a micro dose of 2,4-D. So it's just another example to show we can't necessarily make a clear distinction between a pesticide and a plant growth regulator, because sometimes the same molecule can have both of those types of effects depending on how you use it. Another example would be with carbaryl, a fairly old insecticide, well-known insecticide. It's also used for fruit thinning in apple trees, which is a plant growth regulator effect. So this is where it can get complicated with plant growth regulators, in that we set maximum residue limits for carbaryl, for 2,4-D, And you'd want to make absolutely sure that we're not getting into an area where we could inadvertently have people exceeding MRLs through legitimate uses of some of these compounds.
Okay. Now I think I have a question for Ed. It's going to be similar, I think, to some of the questions you had earlier. The literature on organisms that can be opportunistic human pathogens continues to increase, and among the most dangerous is baker's yeast. Almost every other microbial that is out there has been identified to be a contaminant on catheters, in hospital equipment, etc. But few, if any, have ever caused death. Yet they are categorized as a type 2, and Health Canada would reject it even if it was a terrific plant growth promoter. Can this be managed by regulators? This might be actually a question for more than just Ed, but it was submitted during your section.
So I'm gonna let Fertilizers Canada or Canada's regulators team to answer that one. But from my perspective in the U.S., you know, we are just in the beginning stages of setting these safety assessments for microbials, and so you know, our initial thought is these risk group 1 and risk group 2 are acceptable. They present an acceptable risk versus the benefit, and so they are moved on to the next category of either, you know, literature search or doing and completing a risk assessment. And evaluating those, you know, those site-specific characteristics such as baker's yeast, and really do a comparative study and really do use good risk assessment to justify the benefits and to justify that the risk is acceptable risk.
Eva, did you want to speak to the acceptability of baker's yeast as a supplement?
No. Well, I mean, with respect to any, let's say, microorganism, when it comes for registration, it is going to be subject to the same kind of regulatory scrutiny. One of the mechanisms that reduces, some of you that have had sort of experience applying for registration under the Fertilizers Act, you know that we actually have a tiered registration process that the extent of the data requirements differ depending on the risk profile of the product. And that is very much moving forward with the amended regulations as well. So one way to move from a level 2 or level 3 assessment to a level 1 is when we do a generic literature review. For example, we've done it for Bacillus subtilis. It was done on Rhizobium, and also vesicular as our bacterial mycorrhizae. So those, based on available scientific literature, we can comfortably say that we don't have concerns. Nothing like that was done for yeast. And basically they would be subject to that kind of risk assessment. Do we have concerns or not? Are we going to actually make people do 10 years of toxicological studies? Probably not. But it is always taken on case by case basis. And you're absolutely right. Like, just moving to both David's and Ed's presentations, we see a lot of the nosocomial pathogens, a lot of the opportunistic pathogens. One of our area of collaboration that we definitely want to even further explore is with PHAC. So the Public Health Agency of Canada, they maintain an ongoing assessment list of microorganisms to exclude the pathogens that are of particular concern. For those of you that participated in the January CFPF meeting, we had a presentation from PHAC. It is definitely a great resource for people to consult before they come to us. But the basic questions on human pathogenicity, well, plant, animal, and human pathogenicity, and potentially allergenicity are always asked and factored into our safety assessment. I don't know if you want to add something from PMRA, Michael.
Well, I'd probably rather not. I can't really speak to those types of assessments as I'm not involved in them within the PMRA, but suffice it to say, we do have a dedicated group that does evaluate the microbial products. And one of the considerations is the potential for that product to become a pathogen or infect humans. So it's a consideration. There are prescribed data requirements for it, but unfortunately, I can't get into any of those details as I'm not familiar enough with them. And to my knowledge, I don't think brewer's yeast or baker's yeast, for that matter, has ever been sent to us for review as a pest control product.
Well, we've seen it.
Okay. A question for David. How long in the EU does it take to get a biostimulant to market?
Okay, so first of all, nobody has done it yet. So anything I say is hypothetical at the moment, because so first of all, the dossier must be generated, and one of the parts of that is efficacy. The standards are being written at the moment, but let us presume you will need 1 season of efficacy. You will need some analysis, such as heavy metal analysis, some technical documentation, probably biocontaminant analysis. You prepare that dossier. I would estimate 6 months to prepare the dossier and package it. Send that to the conformity assessment body. Now, the time, there is no legislative time for a response. So whether they respond in 1 week, 1 month, or 6 months will depend on that body. So I would estimate from 6 to 12 months, but I repeat, that's my hypothesis at the moment. I will tell you the real answers in about 2 years' time.
The next question, I think probably I already know that Eva is going to say wait until the 17th, and I'll tell you then. So not 2 years, but a few days. CFIA response times have increased dramatically. Can you speak to what solutions are being put in place to fix that? And it's okay to say wait until the 17th.
No, it's okay. I can tackle that. So first of all, and the only reason I can actually say that is that Governor General has approved the order, so I am not bound by secrecy anymore. The regulations are not in Canada Gazette Part 2, but that is just related to the cycle of its publication. Anyway, we are, when it comes to several elements to the answer, when it comes to the modernized regulations, we obviously are making significant changes to what requires registration and what is exempt. That is going to affect the number of products that are coming our way for approval. We have not made any concrete speculations as to how this is going to impact service delivery standards, because we don't know when we're going to land. Like, we don't know how many new applications are coming in, because it will all depend on the industry, what they decide from their business perspective, what they decide to pursue in terms of registration. So we are going to be monitoring this as closely as we can, and adjust the service delivery standards accordingly. What is very important, as I said before, is that we are launching the electronic submission platform. It doesn't necessarily come with a different time standard, but it is a significant improvement and streamlining of the file processing, or at least the administrative side of things. So we are definitely hoping that that's going to assist tremendously. The one ongoing, obviously, challenge that we are all facing is the COVID pandemic, which has created delays, and the remote work environment. The CFIA is trying really hard to maintain our key activity, which is file review. But it is challenging and it is difficult under the current environment. On top of that, we were frantically preparing for the coming in force of the regulations. So currently we are about 7 to 8 weeks behind service delivery standards, but I'm hoping that we can remedy that after the 10th of November, unless everybody in my section retires on the 12th.
I hope they don't all have the same lottery ticket that wins. We have about 5 minutes left. So unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it, we're going to save all of the rest of the questions and we will get back to you with answers in the future. So to conclude, I want to thank all of our presenters again for this very informative session. This has been excellent. In the background, I want to thank Kevin Jack from Restream for the excellent technical support on this call. I believe there was a question about whether or not the call is being recorded and it'll be available later. Yes, I believe so. For those of you who are interested in receiving continuing education credits, I believe we will have a QR code. There it is. We'll put this code back up on the screen in a moment so that you can scan it and receive credits. But as a reminder, we have 3 more sessions coming up for the Canadian Fertilizer Products Forum. So if you haven't signed up for them yet, you should, because they're going to be very exciting. The next session, as Eva has alluded to, is the always enjoyable CFIA Day on November 17th, where she'll be giving a bit of an update on service delivery standards, on compliance rates, and of course, talking about these hotly anticipated publication in Canada Gazette 2 and what that's going to involve. Then on the 19th will be the Fertilizer and Supplements Advisory Committee is going to hold our annual meeting. And this is also going to include a bit of a bear pit session to gather ideas on regulatory topics that you think we should be tackling next. And then finally, on November 25th will be our keynote speakers, Mark and Ben Cullen and Frankie Flowers. So if you need more information, please contact Allison Watcher or go to the Fertilizer Canada webpage to sign up, same as you did for this session, but each session needs its own sign up. And thank you to everyone for attending. And I hope to see you virtually on the 17th. Have a wonderful day.